We'll begin our look at skeletal tissue today. This will be three parts for this particular set of notes. So skeleton itself has not only the bones associated with it, but also has skeletal cartilage. And some of that cartilage is actually going to be some of the precursors to bone, and some of it's going to stay around after the bone is fully formed as well. So when we look at skeletal cartilage itself, we have some differences that come into play as far as different connective tissues go. And so we're going to see that skeletal cartilage is avascular. It is also not innervated. So it's not going to have good blood supply. And it's not going to have a innervation for pain or anything like that either. And we have three different types: hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage. Those three types are distributed pretty unequally in terms of what we see in different places within the body itself. But the most prevalent of the cartilage is hyaline cartilage, and hyaline cartilage is going to be found in places like, one of its big places is articular cartilage, and so it's going to be found in places where we have the bones essentially starting to rub together, so anywhere where we have articulation between them. Another large place where we have quite a bit of it is the actual costal cartilage, so where we have the individual connection of the ribs to the bones of the sternum, and that forms that component there between the two of them. We do see it in other places that are not necessarily associated with bone as well, and so we see it in the respiratory tract, making up the structures within the larynx as well as within the trachea, and so we have cartilage within those as well. And then a large portion of the actual nose, or what we would think of as the nose, is actually hyaline cartilage. We have some elastic cartilage. The majority of it, again, is not really truly associated with the bones themselves, and so it's going to be found in places like the ear and the epiglottis. And then we have fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage is kind of like a shock absorber. Fibrocartilage is going to give a great amount of tensile strength by resisting compression in places like the meniscus of the knee, the intervertebral discs, in the symphysis pubis, in between the pelvis. Cartilage itself grows similar to that of bone in many ways, and so the initial growth of cartilage is going to have to grow essentially in width as well as growing in length and kind of expanding from within. And so we have appositional growth, and so this is where essentially the outermost aspect of the cartilage begins to just kind of grow more and more and more. And so the structures that are on the very outermost aspect are the ones that are increasing in quantity of that cartilage. We can also have growth from within, and so the actual inside can expand and push out as well. And so the combination of the two allows for growth of cartilage as we have it. Some of the cartilage does become calcified, and so depending upon the type of cartilage it is, it can be completely normal during bone growth. We have all kinds of hyaline cartilage that gets converted into calcified bone, and other times cartilage can start to calcify with age as well, kind of abnormally, and so in terms of the undue stresses that can be against the cartilage itself. And here we just have examples of the different places where we find those cartilages within the body itself. And so things like our fibrocartilage in the meniscus of the knee, all throughout the vertebral column. And so in between all of those intervertebral discs, we have them there. The pubic symphysis on there. Hyaline cartilage is going to be at the ends of all of our articulating bones. And so we can see it there in the elbow, the hip very easily. But even in between all of the wrist bones and the ankle bones, we see that hyaline cartilage as well. When we look at bones, bones can be classified in a few different ways, but one of the simplest ways to classify it is based upon where we find it. So is it either part of the axial skeleton, or is it part of the appendicular skeleton? The axial skeleton, we have the skull, the vertebral column, and the rib cage. And so essentially kind of the torso and the skull is what we have for the axial skeleton. The appendicular skeleton then are the arms and legs. And so these are the components that attach back onto the axial skeleton itself. And so they're going to have some sort of attachment point to get them connected to the actual axial skeleton. We can also classify bones based upon their shape. And so we have several different shapes, regular shapes to the bones themselves. One of which, and the one that we'll talk about the most in terms of in general consequences for bones, are long bones. And so long bones are, as their name implies, longer than they are wide. But they also tend to have a couple of different characteristics to them. They tend to have a long, thin shaft to the bones, and then they expand out on either end. And so there's an expansion of bones. And so we have what we call a diaphysis and an epiphysis to the bones themselves. For our short bones are almost like little stones. And so if we were to take them and disarticulate them out of the wrist and the ankle, and just kind of plop them on the ground or something, you might just walk past them and mistake them for something like a little rock or a little stone on them. So they are kind of cube-like in terms of their shape. They typically have all kinds of articular surfaces within them. And some of our short bones, like those of the patella, can actually be embedded into a tendon. And so we can have bones that are a component within the musculature and provide for a little bit of extra mechanical advantage for them. And so the patella is what we call a sesamoid type of a bone. Flat bones are just that, they're flattened out. They tend to oftentimes have a curve to them, especially those of the skull. But even the sternal bones themselves can have somewhat of a curve to them, especially the body of the sternum itself can have oftentimes quite a bit of a curve to it. And then lastly, we have irregular bones. Irregular bones don't have a generalized shape to them. Oftentimes, in terms of the shapes, they're dictated by the form and function that they need to do. And so muscles that attach into them pull on the different processes that are there. And so we have different areas and different connections for ligaments and tendons and muscles themselves to move them all around. And that creates that kind of complicated, irregular shape to the bones. When we think of bones, typically what we're going to think about oftentimes is their support and protection that they allow for. And so, especially in terms of the protection, protecting things like the brain and the spinal cord, and then our heart, our lungs, in the pelvis, our reproductive organs, things like that. But they also provide for that framework of all of the bones in terms of the support that's there. As far as movement goes, bones can't move on their own. And so a bone has no ability to move all by itself. It needs muscles in order to do so. But when you think about it in terms of the bones provide for mechanical advantage. So they oftentimes work as levers for the muscles to work upon. And the difference in this kind of comes in the difference between, say, a worm and a snake. And so if you think about a worm and a snake, and if you had two that were essentially the same size, and you were going to place a bet on which one is going to win a race, you invariably would pick the snake. They're the exact same size as one another, but the snake is going to be able to move faster because of the mechanical advantage of the bones that it has. And so it's not that the bones really give the ability to move, it gives the ability to move much more efficiently within those. Because the bones are made up of minerals, those minerals can also be stored there in large quantities. And so we have a reserve of the minerals that are inside there, primarily calcium and phosphorus. Calcium is going to be used for all kinds of processes in the body, everything from muscle contraction to nervous impulses to blood clotting. Phosphorus, one of the main components of adenosine triphosphate, and so we have a ready source for that there as well. And then lastly, deep inside our bones, we have the ability, anywhere that we have red bone marrow, we have the ability to make new bone blood cells. All of the different markings that we find on the bones are helpful in determining kind of what attaches to them at times. And so there are all kinds of different types of markings that we can find, usually made by things like muscles and ligaments and tendons pulling on them and creating the shape that they have there. Some of them are created when we move, and so we get different joint surfaces, changing how those muscles are working on the joint itself, and that can alter the joint surface a little bit. Other things are because things are coming and going from the blood in terms of the bones, and we have blood vessels and nerves coming in and out of them, creating foramen for that pathway. So each type of bone marking, and these you'll find in the lab as well on the bones, is you have different types of structures there in terms of the overall appearance of the different markings themselves. And so we have things like tuberosities. Tuberosities are relatively small kind of bumps on the bone, and so it's a rounded projection, but it's also oftentimes just simply almost like the bone is roughened in that particular area where a muscle is inserting into that bone and creating that little bit of a raised portion to the bone. Very different from something like a trochanter, which is a very large uh, projection off of the bone. And so this is where it becomes very irregular because, again, big muscles attaching into it. Where we have a muscle that attaches kind of along the length of a long bone, oftentimes we find a line on the bone. This can also occur on other bones as well, but we have this kind of narrow ridge that it creates as that muscle attaches into it. A little bit different from that from a crest, as the crests are typically right along the edge of the bone. Tubercles are kind of in between a tuberosity and a trochanter. And so with a tubercle, we have a little bit larger of a structure. Oftentimes tubercles are going to be found in different areas than that of the trochanters. And so tubercles we see in and around the humerus, whereas oftentimes or not oftentimes, but the trochanters we find down on the femur. And so a little bit different location for each one of those on those. Around a joint, we're oftentimes going to have what we call a condyle, which is kind of a rounded articular surface. And just above them, typically proximal on the bone, we're going to see an epicondyle, a raised area where oftentimes, again, muscles are attaching into it. Spines are kind of like a pointed, slender projection that runs along the bone as well. And we have kind of the generic term of process that can be used for different bony markings as well. In long bones, we see heads. And so the heads are the expansion point of a long bone. And just distal to those, we're going to see a neck on them. Where bones articulate with one another, and when they do this articulation, they're usually kind of shearing against one another in terms of the movement. We have facets, and so those facets are found on the bones themselves as kind of a flattened surface. Think of like a facet or a facet on a stone is similar to the type of appearance that you're going to see on the bones as well. So we mentioned condyles as being that rounded articular portion on a bone. We're going to see those accompanied typically with an epicondyle as well. Things like the pelvis and the jaw have a ramus, and so this is connecting two bones, and so it kind of looks like a bar. And then we have some openings that we find in bones, and so things that are going to be able to go in and out of the bones. And so we have things like a meatus, and so this is going to be typically like a canal. This one doesn't go all the way through, and so this is typically going to be a blind-ended structure. We then have things like a fossa, which is just kind of like a depression in the bone. We'll see these on places like the scapula, and so we'll see that depression inside the bone where once we start to talk about muscles, those will get filled in by a muscle of a similar name. Foramen are holes that go through the bone, and so not necessarily in a sense directly through the bone, but typically through the outer cortex of the bone and get into the inner parts of the bone. Usually this is where an artery, a vein, a nerve, lymphatics are traveling through the bone, as well as other structures, especially when we see larger ones. Fissures typically come together when we have oftentimes two bones that come together and leave a gap in between the bones that are there. And then in skull bones, we have sinuses, And so this is essentially like the inside of the bone has been kind of carved out, so to speak. And so it's been changed on the inside to where we have a decrease in actual bone structure to lighten the. So when we look at bone, we see that we have kind of two different types of bone that can be found within it. And so once again, we kind of further differentiate between bone types. And so we have compact bone, and compact bone is what we find on the outside of all of our bones. It's dense. If we were to look at it with the naked eye, it would look like it was solid. It would look like there's almost, in a sense, it's like a rock. You can't see through it whatsoever. If we get down microscopically, we'll be then able to see that it's actually got tiny little holes in it that we'll look at later on in the osteons that are there. Spongy bone, we find here, looks a lot like a honeycomb or literally like a sponge. And so think of like a loofah type of a sponge, something like that, or a natural sponge. And it has that same kind of appearance. It's like a big network of bone intertwining with one another. And the actual bony structures are what we call trabeculae. Inside all of the empty spaces that are there, it's generally then filled with red bone marrow. And so we're going to see red bone marrow inside of those empty spaces that are there. So in long bones, we see compact bone along the diaphysis of the bone here. And so that's what makes up the entire portion there. And then the inside here is completely empty. The medullary cavity is kind of like a hollow core inside there. It is going to be filled with bone marrow as well, however. But that compact bone does continue on, and it just gets thinner and thinner and thinner, but it does create the outer covering to all of the bone. And so it does cover the whole bone. So everything that we're seeing here on the outside is all compact bone. Its thickness just changes based upon the need of that particular bone. So when we look at a long bone, we have three distinct regions to the bone that are there, especially in growing bone. In the adult, we basically have two. We have a diaphysis and we have epiphyses. And so the diaphysis is the center part of a long bone. So this is the shaft of the bone. This is the big tube in the middle. In the very center of it, we have what's called the medullary cavity. And so we have an open space that's in the middle there. In the adult, that medullary cavity is filled with yellow bone marrow. In the growing child, that medullary cavity is going to be filled with red bone marrow. They need to make a lot more red blood cells. They need to make more white blood cells. And so that production of all of those cells takes up more of the bone during that time. At the very ends of the bone, we then have the epiphyses. And so each end of a long bone is going to have an epiphysis at the ends of them there. And so both the proximal end and the distal end will have an epiphysis that's there. It has what I mentioned there, where it has compact bone along the outside, and it's oftentimes kind of a thin layer of compact bone. And then on the inside, it has all of the trabeculae. So it has all of the spongy bone making up this network on the inside of the bone itself there. All of that spongy bone is filled in with red bone marrow. And then the compact bone starts to become thicker as it moves down into the diaphysis. Where the epiphysis and the diaphysis join together, in the adult, we're going to see what's called the epiphyseal line or the epiphyseal scar. This is also referred to in growing bone as the metaphysis. And so this is where the bone is growing from at that point. So this is the growth plate of the bone. And so the bone doesn't grow necessarily from kind of the whole bone. It just grows from the two ends. And so depending upon the type of bone that we have here, we have all of our compact bone on the outside and then spongy bone. And then we've got our growth plate once again right in that area. And so that allows for the bone then to grow from that particular space right there. And then it continues to grow on from that point on there. So again, we can kind of see those different spaces. Again, here we see the epiphyseal line or the epiphyseal scar where the bone has thickened just a little bit in that area. You can see on this particular picture as well, you have the compact bone on the outside. Where the bone's going to continue to articulate, we're going to have hyaline cartilage, and so that articular cartilage remains on the outside of the bone. Here we have a image of the medullary cavity and the diaphysis here. And so we see all of that compact bone on the outside. We can see little concentric circles here, the osteons that are there. And the entire bone is covered by what's called periosteum. And so it has connective tissue covering on the outside. The very inside, where the medullary cavity is, has connective tissue as well. This is the endosteum. And so that covers the very inside of the bone also. From there we have the coverings there. The periosteum is a double layer of... So that periosteum that's there surrounding the bone is actually two layers of connective tissue. And so it has kind of two different components to it. When we look at it, we have an inner layer and we have kind of an outer layer. And so the inner layer is the osteogenic layer. This is where on the inside of the bone, we've then got little osteoblasts that are helping to build the bone and add to the bony supply that's there. And then we've got the osteoclasts, which are going to be here as well, and they're going to be starting to break down bone. So we're always going to have kind of this flux of within the bone where we're breaking it down, building it back up, breaking it down, building it back up, always kind of in a process of remodeling all the time. Holding those membranes down for the periosteum, we've got little Sharpie's fibers, what looks like almost like cotton wool or something, connecting the two of them together that are there. Endosteum then removes one of the layers, and we have that on the inside of the bone. So this is on the inside of the medullary cavity. This is on the inside where all of the trabeculae are, on the inside of the osteons. Bones, when we look at them that are not long bones, essentially just have compact bone on the outside. So we have a layer of compact bone, and then we have our layer of trabeculae on the inside. And then on the other side, we're going to have another layer of compact bone. So if this is like a skull bone, that's what we would see on the inside of the bone. The trabeculae and all of the spongy bone on the inside is then filled in with red bone marrow. And so this is what we refer to as diplo on the inside. And so here we can see it on the bone itself. And so we've got our outer compact bone, we've got another layer of compact bone, and then all of that spongy bone on the inside, creating strength to the bone itself. In general, when we think of compact bone, we're going to think about it as being very, very strong because it's so dense. But trabeculae also has the ability to add strength to itself by the way that all of those trabeculae align themselves up with stress on the bones themselves. So I mentioned before that the medullary cavity of long bones is completely filled with red bone marrow in the growing child, but in adults it becomes filled in with adipose, and so it starts to fill in and become yellow bone marrow in the long bones, but we still retain red bone marrow in places like the hip bones, and so in all of the os coxa. We find it in the ends of places like the femur, the epiphyses of the humerus, and then we also find it in the hip bones themselves, and this is where oftentimes things like a bone marrow biopsy or a bone marrow transplant is taken from. The formation of the compact bone is done so in such a way that we have what we call osteons, or the Haversian system. These osteons look a lot like a tree trunk, and so they have all kinds of concentric circles inside of them, and within those concentric circles we have little spaces that are going to be filled in within them called lacunae, and all of those concentric circles, we've then got little pockets inside them where we've got lacunae, and then we have osteocytes that get trapped inside there. The osteocytes can communicate with one another via canaliculi. And the very center, we're going to have our central canal. And so that's where that central canal runs there. And inside there, we're going to have arteries, veins, nerves, lymphatics running through that particular space. So each osteon is like a little circular structure itself. It runs along the length of the bone. And so it's going to run along the portion that's there. Here we can see we have our osteocytes. These are mature bone cells. They used to be osteoblasts. And now they're trapped inside there. It's kind of like they got painted into a corner in a sense as the bone was forming. And as the bone forms and as it grows, it's going to increase in thickness this way. And so all of these osteons continue to grow, and we would form a new osteon here as the bone was starting to grow and grow out from that point on for those. Here we can see one of those nutrient foramen getting blood vessels into the bones themselves. As they go from one osteon to the next osteon, we then have a Volkmann's canal, and so that connects each of the individual osteons themselves. Inside bone, we have three different bone cells. We have osteoblasts, osteoclasts, and osteocytes. These three different bone cells do different things, and so osteoblasts build bone. Osteoclasts break down bone. And so their job is to destroy the bone, liberate all of the minerals that are inside, and then osteoblasts will typically come back behind it and fill it back in. So as we're remodeling bone and generating new bone, the two of them work together. Osteocytes are those osteoblasts that got trapped inside. When the osteoblasts are forming bone, they generate osteoid. And so that becomes the unmineralized component, kind of like the glue that starts to hold everything together. And then that calcifies and becomes the solid bone. One large component of that matrix are hydroxyapatites, or the mineral salts that make them up. Primarily, this is calcium phosphate, but there are other trace minerals that are found within the bone itself as well. And so that's going to add to the hardness and the strength of the bone. The more hydroxyapatites that are there, the denser that is, the stronger the bone becomes. And then next time we'll talk about the formation of bone coming up.